So tēnā koutou, thank you for tuning into this presentation on the risks of landfills and contaminated sites in the face of climate change. I'm Alex Cartwright. I'm a climate and risk consultant at Tonkin & Taylor. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to take you through a high-level overview of the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, or the NCCRA, followed by a deeper dive into the key risks identified within the built environment domain and the risk to landfills and contaminated sites due to extreme weather and sea level rise. There will then be some time for Q&A at the end. So the NCCRA, it was the first one completed in New Zealand, and it was released earlier this year. It provides a picture of how New Zealand may be affected by climate change in the face of climate hazards, and it enables government to prioritise actions and risks moving forward. It was undertaken by a broad consortium led by ACOM, Tonkin & Taylor, NIWA, and a wide-ranging group of academics working in the climate change space. The risks were assessed across 5 value domains. So we had the built environment, natural environment, economy, human, including social and cultural, and governance. Risks were identified now and into the future across 3-stage approach. So first we screened the risks, then we carried out a detailed assessment, and then we looked at urgency. And I'm going to take you through that process today. This was driven by a literature review and a stakeholder engagement, which many of you listening in today will probably have been involved in. So where are we going to from the National Climate Change Risk Assessment? So it built on the work done back in 2018 and 2019 to develop a National Climate Change Risk Assessment framework. Then we've had the National Risk Assessment, which is due to be completed every 6 years, and that now feeds into the National Adaptation Plan. And the adaptation plan is going to be probably released in the next sort of 2 years to run through the process, and then it will be out. And that's focused on some key risks that are identified at the national level. So to start with, what were we looking at? So we're looking at climate change across a broad term of hazards that took into account climate change variables from changing rainfall patterns, and then also hazards associated with that. So it could have been looking at drought and flooding across the country. The top 10 risks that were identified during this process that have been taken forward into the National Adaptation Plan that you can now see on the screen, split across 2 from each of the 5 value domains. So for the natural environment, we had coastal ecosystems and indigenous ecosystems. For the human domain, we had social cohesion and well-being, and also the risks of exacerbating and creating new inequalities in the face of climate change. I'll leave you to read the other ones listed there on the screen. So when we're looking at the built environment priority risks, there are 8 priority risks that were identified. You can see the third one down was landfills and contaminated sites, which is what we're here to talk about today. But just let you have a look at some of those other ones that are listed there. So we had the risk to buildings and communities, to wastewater and stormwater systems, to our linear transport networks, airports, electricity infrastructure. So you can start to see some of the themes around those sectors where these risks sat. The technical report provides a summary of each of these risks, looking at New Zealand's exposure, vulnerability, and resulting consequence. Adaptation urgency was also scored based on the existing knowledge and the need for future action. For example, for buildings and communities, there's good existing knowledge of the communities at risk, where urgency is more around the action that's needed to be taken rather than understanding the risks. This is similar to that of the 3 waters, where again, knowledge is good, with a drive for action still required. So when we're talking around landfills and contaminated land sites, this was identified as a major risk for New Zealand. But why? So it was identified, if you like, on a risk score. We had 5 categories, with extreme the top and major the second from top. And I'm going to take you through the process that we did to understand the risks and how risks to landfills and contaminated land sites came out at a 4, which was major. And I guess a really key important part here is actually understanding the definitions of landfills and contaminated land sites. As a climate change and risk consultant, landfills is not my day job, but I thought that was quite a well-known term. And I've had a real good learning curve around actually the definition of what a landfill is. And so here we're talking across all spectrums of contaminated land sites, landfills, those legacy dumps, and historic landfills, as sometimes they're known as well. So we looked at exposure and vulnerability. Vulnerability being a product of sensitivity and adaptive capacity. And these three things create risk, and that's what I'm going to just take you through now. So for exposure, there was no detailed analysis undertaken, but councils around New Zealand have reported that exposure to landfills and climate hazards is a major issue. So landfills are likely to be exposed to extreme weather and sea level rise, along with coastal and inland flooding. In general, climate change will increase the exposure of landfills and contaminated land sites to inland flooding across New Zealand as well. The big thing is, though, we don't actually know where many of these landfills, legacy landfills, and waste dump sites are. And so it was really difficult to quantify the exposure across New Zealand. We were able to really draw on some of that anecdotal evidence, those historic events that we're all aware of, such as Fox River in 2019, but we weren't able to actually come up with a solid number of how many of these sites were exposed. Work by LGNZ back in 2019 found that there was 112 active and closed landfills within the 0.5 metre mean high water springs, so those that could be affected by the 0.5 metre mean high water springs coastal flood hazard. But those are the landfills that we know about, and there are so many more that we don't know where they are, and they weren't able to be mapped during that process. So that really gives us a really low number, which isn't correct, but at least we know 112 in that coastal area is quite a lot. So then when we look at sensitivity as part of that equation of vulnerability, again, there's no real detailed analysis that's been undertaken in this in New Zealand. We were able to draw on differing factors, including design and characteristics, maintenance, and geography, with some high-level information around landfills that we were able to draw on. So they're generally sensitive to extreme weather, sea level rise, and associated inland and coastal flooding, which can erode cover material, cause side slope failure, and contaminant washout. They can also be sensitive to flooding, which can be the result in association with pollution events due to leachate escape and the release of solid waste. And we've all seen some of those pictures from Fox Glacier, from Fox River, where we saw the waste that came out of a landfill that had failed. So while modern landfills in New Zealand are required to be designed with standards to contain leachate, international research has found that there is likely that leachate will eventually escape all landfills, and even modern landfills with impermeable and low permeability liners. When it comes down to that sensitivity, we can think around modern landfills that have been designed and constructed after the Resource Management Act came into effect in 1991, should be far less sensitive, so have a lower sensitivity to climate change hazards than those legacy landfills and contaminated land sites, those waste dumps that perhaps didn't have such design criteria, and we're unsure of what waste is in them, how they've been constructed, and the conditions of those as well. So in the other part of vulnerability is adaptive capacity. And this is generally very low for landfills and contaminated land sites, given they're located in ground with limited ability to relocate. There are governance-related constraints, such as ownership funding, which can also result in a lower level of adaptive capacity. So this results from land ownership and associated resource consents being tied to specific funding stream, limiting capacity to adapt and to move. There's also just the cost of moving landfills, and we're aware of some of these projects that have been costed up recently to look at how a landfill could be moved, and it is a very expensive and a big task, far bigger than the economic costs. So adaptive capacity is further reduced as a result of the gaps in understanding of landfill locations within New Zealand. So as I say, these older legacy landfills and waste dumps are often discovered during natural hazards events. So when we have a big storm and we find that we've got some waste that's become exposed in a coastal environment, that's the first time we're finding out around that location of that landfill. So the ability to adapt is almost lost because we didn't know about their locations in the first place. There's also an element of interacting risks that we looked at the national level. So this is starting to consider what could happen beyond that of the risk to landfills and contaminated land sites from climate change. So it almost relates into some of those consequences and those cascades, how it interacts with the other risks that we identified. So with this mobilisation of pollutants and solid waste, including glass, metal, asbestos, the consequences of these could be substantial and may include the impact to sensitive environments, ground and surface water contamination. There's also reputational damage, declining health outcomes, and negative impacts on the economic sector, such as tourism. So these events can take a significant time and cost to clean up. And there could be specific consequences and interacting risks for Maori relating to pollutions in areas of food gathering and Mahina Kai and the impact of taonga species. So as part of this risk assessment, once we'd scored landfills as a major risk based on the limited understanding that we had of exposure and vulnerability, we then looked at our confidence in the process that we'd undertaken. And so for this, the risk to landfills and contaminated land was identified with high agreement, but low evidence. So what that meant was we're pretty sure that there is a significant risk to landfills, but we actually just have very limited evidence and a baseline data to be able to understand the scale of this risk. And as that's why it ended up as a major score, because we didn't have the information to really intrinsically understand exposure and vulnerability. So from that, we have also a decision urgency, so that third part of the assessment. And on the screen, you can see our process that we took to undertake it. And we scored each risk by a percentage of how it sat in this decision urgency, from watching brief, sustaining current action, a research priority, and more action needed. So for some of the risks I talked around earlier, so in the built environment, the risks to stormwater and wastewater systems, we have good knowledge, and it was really scored as more action needed. It's quite urgent, and there was something needed to be done. For landfills, it was a split between the two, of research priority and more action needed. So it came out as a really urgent risk that needs addressing, because we need to really understand more around what size the risk is for New Zealand when we're talking around these landfills. So following on from that decision urgency, it's where to from here. So as you'll have told from my presentation, we are missing still quite a bit of information around landfills and these contaminated land sites, legacy dumps, where they are, so if they're exposed to these hazards, but also whether they're sensitive or not. Without that information and a real understanding of the number of landfills at risk, it's really hard for us to be able to give a definitive risk score and know whether actually we are correct in establishing that they're a major risk, or perhaps as we find out more and the numbers grow of the landfills that are exposed, it may be that the risk sits higher and it may be an extreme risk for New Zealand. Or perhaps it may be the case that the landfills that are starting to emerge and waste being exposed in the coastal environments, for example, are some of the few. This is probably unlikely, but we never know. And so we really need to get a consistent approach to assessing risk to landfills and contaminated land sites across New Zealand. This will enable us to get a number. Now, the number won't be correct, but at least we'll be much further on. At the moment, we know 112 landfills are exposed in that 0.5 metre mean high water springs in the coastal environment. But what about the other hazards? What about extreme weather, inland flooding? And then are landfills and these contaminated land sites sensitive to increases in temperature as we see more hot days? We know that there are other countries that operate landfills and have waste dumps that operate in much higher temperatures. But did we design our landfills at the time and these waste dumps that were perhaps a bit more informal for a warmer climate going into the future? And so these are the questions that we need to start answering that will allow us to then think around how we adapt into the future. Are there landfills and contaminated sites that are a key priority for us in the early stages? And then as we progress through the years, there's areas that we want to focus on as an industry moving forwards. To do this, we need this consistent approach, and there is work being undertaken by MFE and Environment Canterbury and other collaborators across local government and other organisations to look at this very question and to try and understand how many landfills are at risk to specific hazards. But we need collective industry buy-in to understand this. We need to follow a process that is consistent and that we can use across New Zealand to start really understanding our landfills and contaminated land sites, risk to climate change now and into the future. So with that, hopefully we'll pass back over to a Q&A session. Thanks for listening.